Chapter 1, Normative Theory. Normative political theory involves, in the words of Isaiah Berlin, the discovery or application of moral notions in the sphere of political relations. It is viewed in these rather narrow terms and a branch of moral philosophy concerned with the foundational and basic moral question that after political life. The remit of the term can, however, be defined more broadly to cover all the political theorizing of a prescriptive or recommendatory kind, that is to say, all theory making concerned with what ought to be as opposed to what is in political life. Normative political thought finds expression in abstract moral reasoning, but also in more detailed discussion of institutions and policies. If in philosophical mode it seeks out or reconstruct guiding moral precepts in its more concrete applications, political theory investigates the implications of moral precepts for actual political practice. Normative theory has a long lineage going back in the West, at least to ancient Greece, and in the East to, among other sources, Confucian and Hinduan philosophy. Since politics is about attending to the general arrangement of a set of people whom chance or choice have brought together, normative theory may appear to be, on the face of it, entirely natural, a way of bringing scholarly attention to the process of attending to our arrangements. Yet, the idea of a distinctive field of theoretical activity devoted exclusively to what ought to be has not met with universal acceptance in academic circles. Some critics have denied that human agents exercise meaningful moral choice. Others have to be doubted that more moral propositions can be meaningful or derived logically from facts about the world. A few have denigrated moral thoughts as such. Despite such criticism, normative theory remains a living and vital branch of political studies. Indeed, it has benefited from a considerable revival of interest since the early 1970s, thanks in part of influence of writers such as John Rawls and Robert Nozick. Its resuscitation follows a long period of retrenchment brought on by the critique from logical positivism in the 1930s and behaviorism subsequently. See Chapter 3. If for some time now these latter schools have been on the defensive, normative political theorists have displayed increasing confidence. Nonetheless, normative theory faces challenges from new directions, as I will show. In discussing the discipline of normative political theory, I will focus largely on developments since the 1970s, although mention will be made, where appropriate, of antecedent thinkers and schools of thought. The key methods and questions. Normative political theory is a way of talking about social institutions, especially those bound up with the exercise of public power, and about the relationship of individuals to those institutions. It scrutinizes the justifications given for existing political arrangements and the justifiability of possible alternative arrangements. Its practitioners employ a variety of methods. Three are typical. Normative theorists are concerned first and foremost with the internal consistency of moral arguments. In measuring this, they bring to bear styles of arguments drawn from, among other resources, formal logic and analytic philosophy. Second, they draw on social science disciplines such as social anthropology and history in order to check the correctness of the empirical premises of arguments or to expose problems in moral arguments not immediately revealed by abstract reasoning. Finally, normative theorists measure the conclusions of their argument against their own moral intuitions. Their argument may expose the weakness of common sense intuitions, but equally, a conclusion that is strongly counterintuitive may signal a weakness in the reasoning that generated it. Normative theorists will differ in the relative weight that they attach to these three elements of abstract logic: social, scientific, and historical evidence and intuition. The key substantive question of political theory since the early 1970s can be arranged very roughly into two sets. The first centers on the existence and purpose of those public institutions we call the state. Are there moral grounds for a state? If so, for what sort? When should we feel obliged to obey its laws? When, by contrast, is civil disobedience justified? A second set of substantive questions is concerned with issues of distributive justice and its implication for freedom or liberty. What is the relative moral importance of freedom and equality? Are there moral grounds for public policies designed to realize some conception of substantive social equality? Would such policies respect the autonomy and liberty of individuals and prove compatible with pluralism? Later in this chapter 1, we shall examine the way normative theorists have debated the role of the state in distributive goods, a topic which addresses substantive questions from both of these sets. Political theorists discussing substantive questions are typically drawn to more basic or foundational issues of moral philosophy. Is there a rationally discernible objective basis to morality? If there is, in what might it consist? Alternatively, is morality a human artifact, the product of convention or community tradition? And why do the answers we give matter to political theory? It is these foundational questions of moral philosophy that must be engaged first of all. Under the next heading, I will examine the competing views that writers have adopted in relation to them. I will then go on to consider the views of those who doubt that moral philosophy is possible at all. The major positions in normative political theory. Since its 1970s revival, normative theory has developed in a variety of directions. Some of its practitioners have restated the basis of older positions. Others, notably the feminists among them, have sought out novel terrain. On the latter, see chapter 5 in this book and Pateman 1989. While not exhausting the field, three broad approaches to normative political theory dominated the debates of the 1970s and subsequently, each drawing on writings of earlier decades and centuries. They are utilitarianism, deontological liberalism, and communitarianism. I shall consider utilitarianism first. Utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a political and moral philosophy associated famously with the radical 19th century social reformer Jeremy Bentham. Like many subsequent utilitarians, Bentham was suspicious of principles of political action founded on abstract or speculative claims about our natural rights and duties. Bentham appealed instead to what he understood to be basic facts about human nature disclosed by empirical observation. Human beings, he claimed, were motivated by the desire to achieve happiness and to avoid pain. Accordingly, Bentham thought that morally correct political decisions were those which sought the greatest happiness of the greatest number in society. This happiness could be quantified in the form of utility, that property in any object whereby it tends to produce tends to produce benefit, advantage, pleasure, good, or happiness, and the object of policymakers should be to maximize aggregate social utility. Bentham did not seek to prescribe the courses of action which would maximize happiness. The definition of what counts as utility would, in the end, be left to members of society. Each individual should define his or her own good, and in social decision making, the interest of each individual should enter equally into the overall calculus of utility. Utilitarianism, in this classic form, has suffered sustained criticism. The idea that pleasures and pains can be quantified and that the otherwise incommensurable wants of diverse individuals can be compared impersonally is widely considered to be implausible. Many critics have worried about the implications for individual or minority rights of the doctrine that conceives the social utility in aggregate terms and refuses the constraints on social action which might be supplied by a theory of rights. Their anxiety is heightened by utilitarianism's reliance on the preference of individuals when some preferences may be highly antisocial. The injunction to seek the greatest happiness of the greatest number may sanction social engineering or a welfare oriented technocracy sanctioned by majority consent. Alternatively, its model of the utility maximizing individual could sanction crude free market apologetics with the public choice theory of the new right as its natural successor. Cultural elitists and religious thinkers fear that equating of all wants amounts to the downgrading of the higher things of life, such as good art or divinely ordained truths revealed in the scriptures. One trenchant early critic of Bentham's utilitarianism was John Stuart Mill. Mill eschewed Mill eschewed a crudely quantitative utilitarianism in favor of one that accommodated qualitative judgments, allowing, for example, that certain kinds of intellectual or aesthetic experiences might be superior to others equally desired. Mill also argued for a utilitarianism that protected certain basic or vital interests of all individuals as a matter of right. Rights themselves contribute to general utility by making safe the very groundwork of our existence, though whether Mill treats right as being inviolable in the face of competing imperatives of a utilitarian kind is not completely clear. Mill noted that the rights will at times come into conflict with other rights and that where they do, only calculations of relative utility can indicate which should prevail. Mill's arguments mark a departure from act utilitarianism, according to which each set should be judged separately for its happiness maximizing consequences, to rule utilitarianism, which should preserve whole systems of constraining rules because of the benefits they bring to society as a whole. A number of writers since Mill have joined the effort to restate utilitarianism in more acceptable or more persuasive terms. Some have sought a greater subtlety or sophistication for their precepts. Others have modified them substantially, while, in part, that foil of recent debates, utilitarianism has continued to be developed in its own right under a variety of labels: consequentialism, teleological ethics, proportionalism, and today presents a considerably more elusive target of attack than did its 19th century predecessor. Readers wishing to follow the more recent development of utilitarian thinking or debates around utilitarianism might usefully begin with the A. Sen and B. Williams collection utilitarianism and beyond, or Raymond Spland's modern political thought. Deontological liberalism. It is largely in opposition to this utilitarian legacy that political theorizing revived in the 1970s, or rather, it took off in opposition to theological ethics of all kinds. By theological ethics, I mean here moralities that judge the worth of humans' conduct according to whether it fulfills a particular purpose or realizes a particular end or telos. Though it does not specify the content of human happiness, utilitarianism is clearly teleological in this sense, but so, for example, is the Aristotelian idea that male and non slave human beings fulfill their rational natures by participating as citizens in the common life of a community. A number of important thinkers' writings in the 1970s, such as John Rawls, Robert Nozick, Ronald Dworkin, and Alan Gewirth, insisted that teleological ethics transposed to political life was insufficient or even hazardous for human freedom for two reasons already alluded to. First, these writers argued utilitarianism does not take account of the plurality of individual ends, either because it specifies one possible kind of purpose, the maximization of happiness or utility, as being higher than the others, or because it judges human good or welfare from the aggregate vantage point of society as a whole or of its greatest number, failing to consider each individual separately. Second, teleological ethics give priority to the ends over the means which might be used to achieve them. In particular, it refuses to allow the pursuit of aggregate social goals should be constrained by inviolable rights enjoyed by each individual. Whilst, as mentioned above, utilitarians have attempted to address such complaints, their critics maintain that the defense of rights under utilitarianism is always contingent and insecure. Utilitarianism has underpinned much liberal thought, but a number of its critics have declared that liberalism requires a more convincing philosophical grounding. See especially Rawls 1972. The writers who made these arguments have to become to be known as deontological or Kantian liberals. Sandel 1984, Plant 1993. They contrast deontology, the ethics of rights or duty, favorably with teleology, the ethics of ends. And the principal reference point for a deontological ethics is Immanuel Kant. Kant was opposed to any conception of politics that might sacrifice individuals to a higher purpose. Individuals were for him ends and not means, as such they were inviolable. Kantian liberals believe that individuals should be free to define and pursue their own ends rather than having the ends of others imposed upon them. If the deontologists have a pluralistic view of human ends, they are not relativist. Certain constraints must be placed upon human behavior, and these should take the form of rights, duties, and entitlements that attach to individuals and which cannot be overridden. Individuals are free and autonomous beings, but they should not be free to violate the freedom and autonomy of others. They may pursue separate goods, but they must proceed within a framework of commonly agreed or universally respected rights, and where the right and good conflict, right should prevail. Liberals insist that collective social action too must respect individual rights, which all deontological liberals insist includes a strong right to liberty. At the same time, Liberals are distinguished from anarchists by acceptance that a public body of some kind is needed to guarantee rights and to make them effective. Even determinedly free market liberals recognize that in order to fulfill its most essential functions, the public body in question, the state, must subject individuals to laws that regulate their behavior or make demands on their private resources. For example, through taxation. The role of the state becomes more controversial among deontological liberals who suggest that it seeks to satisfy welfare as well as libertarian rights. At this point, a whole host of problems arise. What precisely is the state required or entitled to do? Should it simply maintain law and order or to intervene to redistribute wealth? Is there such a thing as a right to a certain minimum of welfare? If individual rights against the state are inviolable, what exactly are those rights? Those arguing for universal human rights court more than just academic controversy. They are speaking to a world marked by the decline of universalistic projects such as socialism and liberalism, growing national, religious, and territorial fragmentation, and by the advance of an identity politics amongst women and ethnic minorities. In such a world, the ground for cross cultural agreement about universal rights often seem tenuous. Of course, the defenders of universal rights will insist that the current multiplication of inter-community conflicts only underlines the need to find some universally agreed yardsticks for adjudicating contending ethnic and natural claims. That, indeed, is on my view. But there are important currents of normative theory whose exponents doubt that such a universal vantage point is either possible or desirable. Some feminists argue that the supposedly universal vantage point of liberal normative theory is in fact a male one, impersonal, abstract, rational, and public, in contrast to the empathetic, practical, and localized way in which women more comfortably address human disputes. Brown 1993. Here I shall focus on another approach critical of deontology that loosely referred to as communitarianism. Sandel 1984, Plant 1993, Bellamy 1993. Communitarianism. Communitarians begin with the critique of the liberal concept of the individual self. The liberal self is, as Michael Sandel puts it, unencumbered, able to adopt a vantage point outside the community of which it is the part, and to define and redefine its aims and commitments of which it is part, without reference to inherited traditions or shared goals. It is endowed with rights and duties specified in purely abstract and universal terms that discounts the claims and obligations arising from our own personal and social ties. Communitarians believe that the individuated self of liberalism is dominant only where communal ties have become eroded and individuals find themselves alienated and adrift, though even here communal life or tradition is the necessary reference point of individual dissent. Normatively, they consider such individualism desirable, a symptom of something wrong. They prefer to speak of a situated self, one that is embedded in a community and defined by the attachments and shared self understandings which frame community life. It is from our community, whether it is a village or subculture or movement or ethnic group, that we derive the specific rights and obligations that make up our more moral particularity. At the same time, we are necessarily implicated in the purposes and ends of our community. Taylor 1975, McLantre 1981, Sandel 1984a, page 5 to 6, 1984b, page 171 to 174. A conception of rights and duties as particular to communities and of purposes as shared by them conflicts sharply with the deontological liberal commitment to universal rights and individually particular ends. Communitarians are suspicious of the way deontologists insist that rights, universal principle of justice, must constrain or set boundaries on pursuit of the collective good. The deontological liberal argue that since we cannot fully understand other people's end, any societal pursuit of the higher social end will impose itself on the self understandings of individuals who make up the society. Sandel, on the other hand, insists that shared life of a community can reduce this mutual opacity, allowing certain common self understandings to emerge among people, and with these goals which are genuinely common and not imposed. In Sandel's eyes, liberals devalue the good by leaving its definition open to the calculations of self-interested individuals. In a community, by contrast, there exists the prospect that all might work towards a morally worthy common good. Sandel 1984. If communitarians are suspicious of rights based liberalism, they do not unite behind any common political alternative. Writers from a wide variety of ideological backgrounds have sought recourse in communitarian positions. They include the conservative writer Michael Oxford, are attracted by the communitarianism's defense of particularity and tradition against universalistic rationalism, and civic republicans such as Hannah Arendt and Michael Sandel, drawn to the prospect of a participatory public life. Today, they attract a new strand of political thinkers wishing to recreate a sense of communal obligation between people on the ashes of what they perceive as the failed individualism of both the new right and new left. See, for example, Etzioni 1993. If communitarianism proceeds from a critique of liberalism, it is itself vulnerable to the objection that it offers insufficient safeguards to individual liberty or protection against a traditionalist or majoritarian tyranny. Some strands of communitarian thought connect with the conservative notions of organic community, in which moral conformity is stressed at the cost of individual dissent. Other strands allow for the possibility of the participatory or democratic community, but liberal defenders might argue leave the individual vulnerable to a heteronomous majoritarian will. The vision of democracy by consensus, which some radical communitarians advance as an alternative to majoritarianism, is arguably impractical in a world of culturally individuated people, or one in which scarcity and conflicts of interest are ineradicable. The attempt to operate the rules of unitary democracy in a diverse community, moreover, threatens to marginalize the often distinctive interest of those who are less effective participators. Manbridge 1980. The more liberty sympathetic or democratic minded communitarians might reply that they envisage participation in or identification with only some kinds of community, and that widespread individual dissociation from common life is a symptom of the fact that the community no longer exists. The question for such communitarianists is not whether individual dissent should be suppressed. It should not be but how a community might be created that all can feel undissentingly a part of. Given that cohesive communities have become increasingly rare and that they are difficult to recreate in today's mobile, globally interdependent world, this reply arguably leaves communitarianism in a condition of either pessimism or important utopianism. More important, seen from a liberty protective standpoint, such an argument offers no good reason for downgrading individual rights. The guarantee of those rights could be considered necessary not only in the long period which must precede the successful recreation of communal life, but if experience of authoritarianism in some past communal experiments is anything to go by, in any kind of commune we can hope realistically to create in the future. Nevertheless, communitarianism does offer some powerful arguments. It makes us conscious of the way our inherited tradition shapes the way we reason morally, so that even in opposition to it, we may find ourselves having to engage its language, for example, by referring to its customary or constitutional provisions protecting dissent. It reminds us that we are born with moral obligations as a community that we can only disown by sounding insensitive to those to whom our predecessors incurred moral debts. Think here of German born after 1945 and the special responsibility they might have in fighting fascism or racism. Communitarianism shows us further how some moral obligations we incur are to the people immediately around us, be they our family, friends, or community, and that abstract moral language works better in public life than in the more informal and mutually empathetic life of, say, a group of acquaintances. In the latter companies, it may often be more appropriate to act out of love or personal loyalty in a spirit of protective paternalism or in way that draw on intimate knowledge rather than according to the impersonal and indifferentiating principles favored by deontologists. Finally, the communitarian ideal of social solidarity addresses a genuine deficiency of our atomized modern life and is probably shared by many who defend individual rights. The main objections to normative theory. The range of positions recovered or generated in the political theorizing since the 1970s is clear very wide. The disagreements internal to political theory between utilitarians, deontologists, communitarian, and others, as well as within these camps, sometimes run very deep. However, it may also be helpful to consider the views of some of those who doubt that the enterprise of normative theory is possible at all. In what follows, I shall consider three broad types of external criticism of normative theory: logical positivism, relativism, and determinism. Logical positivism. Logical positivism is a school of analytic philosophy inspired in part by the early writings of Ludwig Wittgenstein, in particular his Tractatus Logico Philosophicus. The Tractatus is a study of the logic of language, of what makes it meaningful or gives it the capacity to communicate truth. The elemental units of language which give it that power are, he concludes, names, for only names refer directly to the world outside language. Their meaning is not mediated by other propositions of language. They have external objects as their meaning. Conversely, only propositions which refer to external objects can be true. The sole exceptions here are tautological propositions, which are always true by definition, and contradictory propositions, which are always false, again by definition. Wittgenstein did not himself specify the nature of the objects to which true propositions refer, but other logical positivists have insisted that it should be material objects or direct sense experiences. If that is so, then normative theory is, as R. Plant puts it, in deep trouble, for its component parts, words like liberty and justice, do not refer to objects of a material or sensually experienced kind. Wittgenstein himself considered the propositions of ethics, aesthetics, religion, and metaphysics to be nonsense, and held that philosophy should confine itself to the factual or descriptive language of natural science. This pretty much set the tone for subsequent condemnation of metaphysics by two schools of political studies, which logical positivism certified as capable of telling objective truths about the world: behavioral political science and linguistic analysis of political concepts. Both behaviorist and linguistic analysts insisted on separating factually or logically true propositions from values which in their view issued from emotions, sentiments, and attitudes. Their writing suggested that normative theory was about subjective values and could never aspire to the status of a hard intellectual or scientific discipline. How have normative theorists responded to such charges? One response has been to concede that moral propositions are not facts or logically derivable from facts, but to insist that this does no serious damage to the prospects of a rigorous normative theory. In the first place, normative theory can make use of facts, or at any rate of the evidence and arguments which come from the descriptive disciplines of social sciences. The nature of reality as it is, insofar as we know or understand it, is not immaterial to normative theorists. It has been cited in arguments about, for example, the universality or particularity of human traits and needs. While it cannot derive values from facts, normative theory can disclose the logical relationships implicit in a particular moral discourse. Since the members of a moral community rarely subject their everyday language to rigorous examination, normative theorists do perform a special kind of service here, often to exacting standards. A more ambitious response from normative theory insists that moral truths can be shown to have objective foundations. Alan Givert argues that rights to freedom and well-being can be deduced by strict logic from certain basic or generic requirements of human action. John Rawls seeks a moral argument which, if not factual, is nevertheless not a product of particular values either. Rawls believed he can find this in the procedural device of the original position, where he tries to imagine the principles of justice that would be chosen by founders of a new order who have no prior knowledge of their natural endowments, social resources, status, and so on. People who are forced to devise principles neutral enough to cover any prospective member of the future society, since they could be any one of those members. My own inclination is to doubt that values can be derived in a strictly logical way from facts, or that they can be factual themselves. Even if Givert can demonstrate a strict logical link between a human right to freedom and well-being and certain facts about the requirements of human action, it is not clear that what would prove, since a person not sharing Givert's methodology could deny that rational consistency carries moral salience, or that the rational consistency of a moral proposition with a fact makes it a fact. Similarly, Rawls' brilliant idea of the original position is best seen, as Ronald Dworkin would have it, as a device whose choice in the first place reflects as an antecedent moral commitment to equal concern and respect for human beings. Factual argumentation is salient to normative theory, but normative theory is not a variant of it. Relativism. Moral relativist, the second group of critics one wish to consider, might argue that if morals cannot be derived from facts, then they are indeed, in the final instance, purely relative. And if they are purely relative, if no one value position can be described as better than another, then there is no point in normative theory as such. If moral claims are fiercely contested, yet at the same time matters of opinion rather than fact, how might one ever adjudicate them? Communitarians answer that particular moralities may still have a role where transcendent ones are foregone. Certain things may still be morally right within a particular community and its language game, even where they are not universally right or wrong. Pure moral relativism would require that every individual be an island. But the nature of language is that we are not, and that moral and other meanings are intersubjectively constituted. Ipso facto, there is still a place for morality in the world, and indeed for normative theorists who set out to explicate in a coherent and deep way what it is that a community's own cultural language entails in moral terms. The answer will not quite to do moral argument in today's world does not take place in hermetically sealed language games. Language games encounter each other when countries go to war, when they give each other economic or military aid, when they trade or pay debts, when they join common organizations and subscribe to common charters. If there is not as such a coherent global moral community, it is nonetheless clear that moral languages overlap, crosscut, mix, engage with each other, and shift in response to external pressures. A communitarian might argue that if such fluid interaction heightens the possibility of a collision of moral language games, it requires all the more urgently that each be accorded equal respect, the better to avoid conflict or imposition. But this kind of reasoning seems plausible only up to the point. In some situations, it may legitimate oppression within moral communities or abolish all agreed criteria of conflict resolution between them, and confounding the aims of a communitarian pluralism. The pure celebration of moral and cultural differences will not help if another community's language game allows that your own territory be seized or that one of your citizens be sentenced to death by a foreign power, or that their case, one might argue, for seeking cross communal clarity about the criteria that might reasonably be used to adjudicate the competing claims of moral communities sharing spaces or resources. What, in any case, is a moral community? It is difficult to say a nation state as one when most entities the size of a nation state will be certain to harbor differences of moral perception. Groups or individuals, dissidents in one nation state, may feel oppressed by their own rulers and appeal to other nations for help. Individuals may form group allegiances that cut across national boundaries. Again, it is difficult to see an ethnic group or a sex as a moral community in a bounded sense. Perhaps only a genuinely voluntary association of consenting adults can be that. But even it participates in a wider moral universe when it interacts with other outside that association. The strongest reply from normative theory